The reporter from this Billings Gazette was a young man, maybe 25, with clean hands and ink stains on his fingers. He sat across from Ida Calloway Aldrich in the front room of her home, his notepad open, his pencil ready. It was 1924. Ida was 67 years old. Her hands resting in her lap told a different story than her face knuckled and scarred, the kind of hands that had argued with stone and won. He asked her how it felt to have survived what most people would consider impossible odds. She looked at him for a moment, the way a woman looks at a question that has missed the point entirely. "I didn't think about odds," she said. "I thought about problems and solutions. Needed shelter, found a hillside. Needed heat, remembered Ernst's stove. Needed to survive, so I did the work." The reporter wrote that down. He thought it was a good quote. He had no idea it was the entire story compressed into 4 sentences. Cut back 51 years, November 14th, 1873. The wagon didn't slow down. Harlan Calloway simply reached back, pushed the canvas flap aside with one thick arm, grabbed his daughter by the collar of her coat, and dropped her into the road like she was a sack of grain that had gone bad. The blanket she'd been sleeping under landed beside her in the dust. The wheels kept turning. The canvas flap settled back into place. The rest of the family kept their eyes forward. Ida sat in the road and watched the wagon go. She was 16 years old. She was sitting in the middle of the Bozeman Trail in what would become Montana territory, and the temperature was already falling toward 15 degrees. The Absaroka Range cut the western sky into jagged pieces. The nearest settlement was Bozeman, 43 miles northeast. She had no food, no tools, no weapon. The clothes she wore and one blanket were the sum total of everything she owned in the world. She sat there and watched the wagon shrink against the mountains until it was a dark speck, and then it was nothing, and then it was gone. The other wagons in the train passed her one by one. Some of the drivers looked. None of them stopped. A woman in the third wagon met Ida's eyes for just a moment before looking away. Ida stayed sitting in the road until the last wagon had passed. Then she stood up, brushed the dust from her skirt, and began to study the landscape. Here is what everyone who watched expected her to do: chase the wagon, scream, break down in the road, and wait for someone to take pity on her and come back. That is what a frightened 16-year-old girl was supposed to do when her father dropped her on a trail in November in Montana territory. Ida Calloway did not do any of those things. She turned slowly the way a man reads a room before he sits down in it. To the west, lodgepole pine climbed the slopes in dark green columns. To the north, cottonwoods marked a creek maybe 200 yards off the trail. The valley here was narrow with the hills pressing in close on both sides. The Bozeman Trail ran through it because travelers before her had already done the calculation: water, timber, shelter from wind. The same thing she needed. She picked up the blanket, shook the dust out of it, folded it over her arm, and started walking toward the tree line. If she was going to die out here, it was not going to be from giving up. What Harlan Calloway had not understood, what he had never once in 16 years thought to look for, was what his daughter had been doing for the 4 months they had been traveling west from Pennsylvania. While her father drove the wagon, Ida watched. She watched the wheelwright in their party replace a cracked axle outside of Fort Laramie, noting how he measured the fit by feel rather than by sight, how he knew by the sound of the mallet whether the joint was seated properly. She watched the blacksmith weld a broken trace chain back together, and she understood that heat was not just warmth, it was a tool, something that could be shaped and directed and made to do work. She watched a Swedish family build their first shelter out of sod, cutting it in bricks and stacking it with the grass side down, and she saw how the earth itself became the wall, how the mass of the ground could hold warmth, the way a stone holds the heat of the afternoon sun long after the light is gone. But the one she watched most carefully was an old German stonemason named Ernst Vogel. Ernst was somewhere in his 70s, weathered down to the essentials, with hands that looked like they had been carved from the same oak he used for tool handles. He rode in the fourth wagon, and he talked constantly to anyone who would listen about something he called the Cachalofen. It was a masonry heater, he said. A firebox built from stone with long, winding channels inside the chimney structure, channels that forced the smoke and heat to travel a long path through stone before exiting, transferring warmth into the mass as it went. Then the stone radiated that heat slowly for hours after the fire had died. A conventional fireplace lost 80% of its heat straight up the chimney. A proper cackalofen kept 70% in the room. He drew diagrams in the dirt. He sketched the channel layouts with a stick. He explained the physics of thermal mass with the patience of a man who had spent his life watching people freeze to death from ignorance. Almost everyone ignored him. Ida listened to every word. She did not just listen. On two separate nights while her family slept and the fire had burned down to coals, she used a nail to scratch the key dimensions of Ernst's channel design into the back cover of her father's Bible, not deeply enough to be noticed, just enough to remember. The firebox width, the channel length, the chimney height needed for proper draft, the ratio of firebox opening to flue exit that Ernst had said was the difference between a fire that breathed and a fire that suffocated. Those numbers lived in the grain of the leather, and they lived more precisely in the part of her mind that did not let go of things that mattered. Harlan Calloway had thrown away his daughter for teaching her sisters to read from that Bible. He had not thought to look on the back cover. The creek was where the cottonwoods said it would be. It ran clear and cold, spring-fed from somewhere higher up, cutting through the valley floor in a channel maybe 4 feet wide and 2 feet deep at the center. Ida knelt at the bank and drank until her stomach ached. The water was cold enough to make her teeth hurt. She did not care. She found her first campsite 30 yards downstream, where the bank had cut itself into a natural overhang, a cut bank maybe 4 feet high, with enough projection to deflect the wind and shed snow. She gathered deadfall branches until she had an armload piled them across the opening and crawled inside with the blanket pulled over her. The night nearly killed her. The temperature dropped to 9 degrees by her estimate, cold enough that her fingers went numb even tucked under her arms, cold enough that she shook so hard her teeth rattled continuously, not in bursts, but in a steady vibration she could not control. The blanket helped, but not enough. The branch pile blocked wind, but not cold. She was not warm. She was only dying more slowly than she would have been in the open. She did not sleep. She had heard enough from the older travelers to know that sleeping in cold like this without proper shelter and heat meant not waking up. So she counted instead. She counted to 1,000 and started over. She counted the wagon wheels she had watched being repaired on the Journey 17. She counted the meals she had helped her mother prepare before her mother died. When Ida was 8, she lost count somewhere above 400 and started over. She did not count the number of times her father had told her she would never amount to anything. She had stopped keeping track of that a long time ago. When dawn came gray and bitter and indifferent, she crawled out of the cut bank and stood in the thin light with the blanket around her shoulders, and she understood something clearly for the first time. Shelter without heat was just dying slower. She needed fire. She needed it today. The first 2 days were an education in failure. She tried the bow drill method she had seen demonstrated back in Pennsylvania. Could not get it to work with frozen fingers and wood she did not know well enough. She tried striking rocks together until her knuckles bled. She found granite outcrops and sandstone formations in a vein of white quartz, but nothing that threw the sharp hot spark she needed. She tried again and again with different combinations of stone, different angles, different pressures, until her hands were cut and her arms were shaking from more than cold. Nothing. The second night was colder than the first, 6 degrees. She built the branch pile thicker and wedged herself deeper into the cut bank and counted slowly and did not sleep. In the morning, she started walking the half-mile radius around her campsite methodically back and forth in overlapping lines, looking at the ground the way Ernst Vogel had looked at stone, not as scenery but as material. On the 5th day, she found a broken bottle. Someone had thrown it from a wagon months or years before. It was half buried in the silt at the edge of the creek, the brown glass worn smooth on the outside, but still curved, still intact. Ida held it up and turned it in the weak November sunlight. The glass concentrated the light into a point of brightness that tracked across her palm as she moved it. She built the most careful fire she had ever attempted. She gathered the finest, driest tinder she could find, shredded cottonwood bark, and inner threads of dried grass, the dusty powder from the inside of a rotted log. She arranged it in a small bundle and held the glass over it at the angle that concentrated the light to its sharpest point. She held her breath and held perfectly still. It took 3 hours. Her arms shook from holding the position. Her back ached. The light shifted as the sun moved, and she had to recalculate the angle twice. But she was patient. She was not going to die from impatience when she had not died from cold. The smoke came first, a thin thread of it, almost invisible. Then a faint glow in the center of the tinder bundle. Ida lowered her face to within inches of it and blew with the slowest, steadiest breath she could produce. Her head went light from the effort of breathing so carefully. The glow spread. A tiny flame appeared fragile as a whisper. She fed it with her hands shaking, adding grass, then small sticks, then larger ones, working the fire upward through sizes the way Ernst Vogel had described, working a fire in a proper heater. Give it what it can handle, no more. Let it establish itself before asking it to do more work. When the fire was the size of both her fists, she sat back and stared at it. She had been 16 years old and alone in November in Montana Territory for 5 days without fire. She was alive. She fed the fire for an hour and sat close to it and let the warmth move through her clothing into her skin. Then she began to think about shelter. Not just any shelter, the right shelter. The cut bank was temporary and wrong in ways she understood better each day. It faced northwest, which meant the worst wind hit it directly. It was low, which meant it would fill with snow. It had no way to hold heat. It was at best a slightly slower way to freeze. She spent the next several days learning the land. She checked every hillside within a mile. She looked for south-facing exposures that would catch winter sun. She looked for natural windbreaks in rock formations that could become walls with less work than building from nothing. She found several promising spots and rejected them each in turn, too exposed on one side, right? Wrong drainage, no water access, soil too loose to hold a foundation. During those same days of scouting, she dug. Not the cabin foundation yet that would come later in the right location, but drainage. She had been thinking about what happened to hillside shelters in spring, about the way snow melt ran downhill and followed the path of least resistance, and she had watched enough of the journey west to know that water finding its way under a foundation was the quiet killer of structures that had survived everything else. Wherever she built, she would need a channel along the uphill side to carry meltwater around the shelter rather than through it. She practiced the technique on a small slope near the creek, learning how deep and how wide and what angle moved water efficiently without undermining the adjacent ground. On November 26th, she found what she was looking for. A quarter-mile upstream from her campsite, the valley narrowed and the hillside cut inward, forming a natural alcove, 12 feet deep, 15 feet wide. 3 sides of solid earth and rock walls already built by geology. The fourth side faced south. A creek tributary ran within 50 feet of it, which meant water without a long carry. And the hillside above it was exactly the kind of slope she had been practicing drainage on. She could see immediately where the melt would run and what a channel needed to do to redirect it. She stood in the center of that alcove for a long time. A conventional cabin required 4 walls. This required 1. The earth itself was doing the rest of the work. She could build a front wall across the 15-foot opening, 4 feet thick, to reach the hillside on either side, and install a door and have an earth-sheltered cabin that would stay warmer than any freestanding structure in the valley. And most importantly, the hillside's thermal mass would work with her chimney design, not against it. The stone she would build inside would radiate into a space already partially insulated by the earth pressing in from 3 sides. It was November 26th. She estimated she had 3 weeks before the serious snow began. She got to work. The first tool she made was a digging bar from a piece of hardwood limb, fire hardened at one end to a blunt point. She used it to break the frozen surface of the ground inside the alcove, leveling the floor, pulling rocks out of the way, clearing years of debris. Her hands blistered by the end of the first day. By the end of the second day, the blisters had broken, and the raw skin underneath had begun to harden into something tougher. She dug the foundation trench across the entire 15-foot opening, first down 3 feet to where the ground stopped being frozen earth and became the solid subsoil she needed. Then she dug the French drain along the back wall, a channel 3 feet deep, running the full width of the alcove angled to carry water east around the structure's downhill corner. She packed it with flat stones that would let water move through without carrying soil. It took a full day she did not have to spare, but she did it because a shelter that flooded in March was no shelter at all. She ate what she could scavenge. A grouse she managed to hit with a thrown rock, more luck than skill. Rose hips still clinging to bushes along the creek, shriveled but edible. On the fourth day of building, she found an elk carcass. A quarter-mile east wolves had killed it and eaten their fill. She cut meat from the hindquarters with a sharp piece of flint and dried it over her fire in thin strips. It gave her 4 days of real food before it turned. She fitted flat sandstone pieces into the foundation trench one by one, choosing stones that would lie level and interlock without gaps prying them into position with her hardwood bar packing creek, clay between them. The work was slow. Everything was wrong. The wrong tools, the wrong conditions, barely enough food to maintain the strength she was spending. She lost weight she did not have to lose. She could feel her hip bones more prominently each morning when she pulled her skirt on. But the work kept her warm during the days, and the purpose kept her from the paralysis that killed people not through cold, but through despair. On December 3rd, she had the foundation trench filled and was beginning to lay the first course of wall stones. That was when Dietrich Brauer found her. He came from the north following the creek riding a mule that looked nearly as old as he did. Dietrich was in his late 50s with a weathered face and the careful eyes of a man who had learned to read weather and people with equal attention. He was German, 3 years established on a homestead 7 miles north of here, and he had outlasted 2 Montana winters on stubbornness and good stonework. He stopped the mule at the edge of the alcove and watched Ida wrestle a 40-pound stone into position without speaking. She did not acknowledge him. She had the stone almost where she wanted it, and she was not going to lose her grip to be polite. When the stone was set, she straightened and looked at him. "You're the Callaway girl," he said. "The one put off the wagon." "Yes, sir." He did not respond to that. He dismounted, walked over to her foundation, and crouched down to examine the stonework. He ran his thumb along 2 joints, checking the fit. He pressed on a cornerstone to test its seat. He looked at the alcove, at the 3 natural walls of earth and rock, at the south-facing opening at the drainage channel he had dug along the back wall. "Who taught you that jointing?" he said. "A stonemason named Ernst Vogel. He was in our wagon train." Dietrich looked up from the foundation. Something moved in his expression, not surprise exactly, but the kind of recognition that carries weight. "Ernst Vogel," he repeated, and the name sounded different in his mouth, more precise, the way a man says the name of someone he has known rather than someone he has heard of. He stood, brushed the dirt from his knees, and looked at the pile of stones she had been gathering. He looked at the alcove again, calculating something. "You planning to put a chimney in this?" "Yes, sir, not a conventional one." He waited. "Kakalofen design," she said. "Serpentine flute channels through the mass. Single fire in the morning heat, holes through the night." Dietrich was quiet for a long moment. The mule shifted its weight and blew a breath that steamed in the cold air. "I know what a kakalofen is," he said. He walked back to the mule, reached into one of the saddlebags, and pulled out an axe head, no handle, but the blade still solid, still true. He set it on the foundation wall. Then he reached in again and brought out a cloth package that smelled of salt. "Pork," he said. "Few pounds. You're going to starve otherwise." He set that beside the axe head. Ida looked at what he had left. The axe head, the salt pork. She kept her voice steady. I'll pay you back come spring. Dietrich waved that off the way a man waves off something that has missed the point. Don't die, he said. I've got enough ghosts on this creek. He mounted the mule and rode back north along the creek without looking back. Ida stood there for a moment looking at what he had left. The axe head would change everything. With a handle carved from the right wood, she could fell trees instead of just gathering deadfall. She could cut the timber she needed for the wall frame. She could build something that would actually hold. She understood that what Dietrich Brauer had given her was not just an axe and a few pounds of meat. He had looked at her work and he had left tools. That meant he thought the work was worth continuing. She carved the handle from a piece of green ash she found along the creek, splitting it to shape with a sharp flint edge and finishing it with patient scraping until it fit the eye of the axe head snugly. She wedged it with a sliver of hardwood soaked in water, let it dry and swell in the joint overnight. In the morning, she swung it twice against a pine and the head held. She began cutting lodgepole pines. Not the large ones, those were beyond what she could move alone and beyond what she needed. She wanted straight ones 6 inches through 30 feet long. She felled them, limbed them with the axe, and dragged them to the alcove one at a time, the cut end over her shoulder, the trunk making a long groove in the snow behind her. The front wall design came to her as she worked. 2 log frames, one inside one, outside, with the cavity between them packed with fitted stones and clay mortar. The inner frame would carry the roof load. The outer frame would protect the stone fill from weather. The mass of stone and earth between them would insulate against cold. 4 feet thick at the base, tapering slightly. Crude but sound. By December 8th, she had the log frame standing and was beginning to pack the cavity. That was the day Garrison Pruitt arrived. He came from the west, riding a good horse, wearing a coat that spoke of actual money. 42 years old, former Union Army engineer, currently trying to establish a homestead 5 miles up the valley. He had the bearing of a man who had spent 20 years being the most technically competent person in any room, and he looked at Ida's construction with the expression of a man who is preparing to explain where someone has gone wrong. He stood in front of the alcove and itemized her mistakes. First, the chimney she was planning would collapse under its own weight. No proper foundation under it, and clay mortar would not hold through the expansion and contraction of heating and cooling cycles. Second, the firebox was wrong. She was using sandstone. Sandstone cracked from thermal shock. She needed fire brick. Third, she had no way to calculate draft properly. That chimney would either smoke her out or suffocate the fire. Fourth, she was building into a hillside. Come spring thaw, she would have water running through the cabin. Ida kept working while he spoke, fitting stones into the wall cavity, pressing clay into the joints, checking each stone's seat with her palm. When he finished, she set down the stone she was holding and looked at him. The chimney has a foundation, she said. You're standing on the edge of it. I dug 3 feet down and built up from bedrock. Garrison glanced down at the ground. The firebox stones will crack eventually, she continued, but they'll hold through this winter, and I'll replace them in summer when I can get proper material. The draft I calculated from what Ernst Vogel taught firebox opening is 2 feet wide and 18 inches tall. Chimney exit is 1 square foot, and I have 15 feet of vertical rise from firebox to cap. The ratio is right for the serpentine channels. As for the hillside drainage, I dug a French drain along the back wall before I laid the foundation. The spring melt will go around the cabin, not through it. Garrison did not respond immediately. He walked around the construction, checking the foundation she had described, examining the stonework in the wall cavity, finding the drainage channel along the back wall exactly where she said it was. He looked at the orientation of the alcove. He was an engineer. He could not look at what she had built and call it wrong when it was not wrong. He did not admit that out loud, but he also did not repeat his objections. You've got a week, he said finally, before the serious weather hits. After that, you won't be working outside. Better have that roof on and the chimney finished. I will, Ida said. He mounted his horse and rode west without another word. Ida watched him go, then turned back to the wall and picked up the next stone. He had come to prove she was wrong. He had stayed long enough to see that she was not. He had left without helping and without apologizing. That was fine. She had not asked for either. She kept working. The chimney was the heart of everything. Ida understood this the way a doctor understands that the heart is not merely one organ among many. It is the thing everything else depends on. You could build walls out of mud and sticks. You could roof a shelter with bark and wishful thinking. You could sleep on pine boughs and eat boiled leather and survive on sheer stubbornness. But without heat, real heat, sustained heat, the kind that held through a Montana night, when the temperature dropped past zero and kept dropping, none of the rest of it mattered. The walls were just a container. The chimney was what made the container livable. She had been thinking about the design every night for 2 weeks, lying in the cut bank, or later in the half-finished alcove, running the numbers through her head the way Ernst Vogel had taught her to run them. Not with paper, not with instruments, just with the logic itself held carefully in mind and turned over and examined from every angle until the weak points showed themselves. The numbers she had scratched into the back cover of the Bible were anchors: firebox width, channel length, chimney height, the critical ratio of opening to flue exit, and she returned to them in her mind the way a navigator returns to fixed stars, checking her calculations against what Ernst had drawn, making sure the design she was building in her head matched the one she had preserved in leather and nail scratch on those dark wagon nights. The firebox had to be right first. Everything upstream of the firebox determined what the channels could do. She spent December 9th and 10th on nothing but the firebox, selecting stone with a patience that would have looked obsessive to anyone watching. The sandstone she had been using for the walls was adequate for structural work, but wrong for a firebox, too porous, too variable in density, too likely to crack when heat hit it fast and hard. She spent half a day working the creek bed upstream, turning over every stone she found, checking for the densest, most uniform pieces. What she wanted was stone that had been compressed by water pressure over a long-time stone without visible seams or grain lines, stone that rang slightly when struck, rather than thudding dead. She found enough. Not perfect, she had no illusions about perfect, but enough to build a firebox that would hold through one Montana winter. That was all she needed it to do. The firebox went in the back corner of the alcove against the solid earth wall, where the hillside's thermal mass would work with it rather than independently. She built it at floor level, which was right for radiant heat warmth that rises from the floor, moves through a room differently than warmth that falls from above. The opening was 2 feet wide and 18 inches tall, big enough to take substantial wood, small enough to concentrate combustion. She mixed the mortar from a creek, clay, and fine sand, 2 parts clay to 1 part sand, worked with enough water to make it hold shape without cracking when it dried. She packed it into every joint, smoothed it with her thumb, and moved to the next stone. By the end of December 10th, the firebox was built. She let it cure overnight. The channels were next, and the channels were everything. The principle Ernst had explained was simple enough to state and difficult enough to execute. Smoke carries heat. In a conventional chimney, that smoke travels straight up and out, taking most of its heat with it. The room gets perhaps 20% of what the fire produces. The other 80% goes into the sky. A cachalophon forces the smoke to travel. Instead of a straight vertical path, the channels wind through the stone mass, horizontal runs corners, rises more horizontal runs before finally exiting through the vertical chimney stack. Every inch of that travel means heat transferring from smoke into stone. By the time the smoke exits, it has given up most of its heat to the mass around it. Then the mass radiates that heat slowly, steadily for hours after the fire has died. The key was surface area. The more stone the smoke touched on its journey, the more heat transferred. But there was a limit, too much resistance in the channels, and the fire couldn't draw enough air to burn properly. It would choke smoke, suffocate. The serpentine path had to be long enough to capture heat, but open enough to breathe. Ida built the first channel rising from the back of the firebox, angled slightly to encourage draw, then turning horizontal to run along the full width of the back wall 8 feet. At the far corner, it turned again and ran forward along the side wall toward the front of the cabin another 7 feet. Total travel before the exit stack, 15 feet of stone contact. 15 feet of surface area for heat exchange. She built it in sections fitting each stone packing mortar, letting it partially set before adding the next course. The interior of each channel she smoothed as carefully as she could because rough surfaces created turbulence that disrupted draw. She used her smallest finger to reach into corners and press mortar flat. On December 11th, while she was halfway through the second channel run, Thaddeus Wren arrived. He came from the east, which meant he had ridden up the Bozeman Trail rather than cross-country. He was 47, a railroad surveyor, scouting routes for the line that would come through the valley within the year, and he carried himself with the particular confidence of a man who had built things in difficult places and knew the difference between construction that would hold and construction that would fail. He tied his horse to a pine at the alcove's edge and walked in without being invited. Ida kept working. He studied the chimney structure for several minutes without speaking. He checked the mortar joints with his thumbnail. He traced the channel path with his eyes, working out the geometry of it. He crouched down and looked at the firebox opening, then looked up at where the exit stack would be. "Draft will work," he said finally. Ida kept packing mortar. "You've got a problem you haven't solved yet," he said. She looked up. "Backdraft. When the big storms come through this valley, the wind doesn't just blow horizontal, it comes down off the ridgeline and hits the valley floor at an angle. Hits your chimney stack from above. Pushes air down instead of letting smoke up. You'll get the fire going, the channels will fill with smoke, and then the wind will drive it all back into the cabin." Ida set down her trowel stone. She thought through it now quickly. The chimney exit was at the front corner of the cabin, exposed to whatever came down the valley. If the wind came from the northwest at the right angle, the pressure differential could reverse the draw entirely. "Wind cap," she said. "Wind cap," he agreed. "You build a collar around the top of the stack stone, 4 sides openings on all 4 faces, then cap it with a flat stone. Wind hits the collar instead of going straight down the pipe. Smoke can still exit through the side openings, but the direct downward pressure is blocked." They built it together over the next day and a half. Thaddeus directed and occasionally demonstrated. Ida did most of the physical work because the work was hers and she intended to keep it that way. He seemed to understand that without being told. The wind cap added 30 inches to the stack height and changed the exit geometry completely. Thaddeus looked at the finished cap, checked the mortar, stepped back. "That'll hold," he said. He untied his horse, mounted, and rode back east toward the trail. Ida looked up at the chimney stack against the gray December sky. It was December 14th. The roof had to go on today. The roof logs went up fast compared to everything else because fast was all she had left. She had 8 lodgepole logs cut and limbed and waiting. She rolled them up onto the wall frames one at a time, using a pole lever, positioning each one across the span, fitting them tight together. Then a layer of pine bark stripped from dead trees overlapped like shingles. Then 8 inches of earth shoveled up from the floor of the alcove and packed down solid. She sealed the chimney stack where it penetrated the roof with packed clay and bark strips. It was not perfect. It would need attention in the spring, but it would hold against snow and wind for one winter. By late afternoon on December 14th, she had a roof. She stood inside the cabin, really inside it for the first time, with walls on all sides and a roof overhead, and the difference was immediate and physical. The wind was still outside. She was not. She spent the last available day stuffing every wall gap she could find with handfuls of dry moss and grass. She hung the blanket across the door opening. She built a sleeping platform from poles lashed together with strips of bark and covered with a thick layer of pine boughs. She stacked every piece of dry firewood she had gathered inside the cabin against the wall opposite the chimney. Then she looked at the kakelofen, the firebox and channels and chimney mass that she had built stone by stone over 2 weeks with a borrowed axe and bare hands. She thought about Ernst Vogel on the wagon drawing his diagrams in the dirt while people walked past without stopping. She thought tomorrow we find out. December 15th, temperature at dawn 12 degrees below freezing. Snow beginning not heavy yet, but steady, the kind of snow that intended to stay. Ida built the fire carefully the way Ernst had described building the first fire in a new kakelofen, small and slow to begin letting the mortar cure fully under gentle heat before asking it to handle real combustion. She used dry pine shavings first, then finger-thick sticks, then pieces the size of her wrist. She kept the firebox door a flat stone she could slide across the opening, propped slightly open to allow maximum air intake. The fire caught, and she fed it steadily. For the first 15 minutes, nothing came out of the channels but cold air and the smell of damp clay curing. She watched the smoke move into the firebox and disappear into the first channel. She put her hand near the back wall where the first horizontal run went. Nothing yet. Then at 20 minutes, she felt it a faint warmth, barely above ambient temperature, moving through the stone at the far end of the first channel run. She kept feeding the fire. At 40 minutes, the first channel stones were warm to the touch along their full length. The smoke was traveling the path, giving up heat as it went. The mortar joints were holding. The draw was working. Then the smoke came back. Not all of it, a thin thread of it backing out through the firebox opening, curling up toward the roof. The draw had reversed somewhere in the second channel. She could smell it before she could see it clearly, the sharp bite of pine smoke where it should not be. She slid the flat stone across the firebox opening and stood back. The second channel ran along the side wall toward the front of the cabin, the channel closest to the exterior, most affected by cold air on the outside of the wall. Cold air meant denser air, which meant higher pressure on that side, which meant the draw was fighting a pressure gradient it could not overcome. The channel was too close to the outer wall, or the stack wasn't tall enough, or both. 12 degrees outside. 2 hours until dark. She went up. She climbed onto the roof in the snow, moving carefully because the earth's surface was slick, and a fall from here would be a problem she could not afford. She found the chimney stack and began pulling stones from the top, adding height. Her hands were numb within 5 minutes. She could not feel the individual stones, only their weight. She worked by pressure and position rather than sensation, fitting each stone by pushing it into place and checking stability with her forearms since her fingers had stopped reporting accurately. 18 inches. She added 18 inches of stone to the stack height, mortaring each course as she went packing the joints with cold clay that did not want to stick but stuck anyway because she pressed it hard enough. She came back down, built the fire again from coal she had preserved under ash in the firebox, fed it slowly back up to full burn, put her hand near the second channel wall, waited. The warmth came through at 30 minutes. This time it did not reverse. The increased stack height had changed the pressure differential enough. The draw was pulling clean and now smoke moving through the serpentine path, the way it was designed to move, giving up heat to stone at every turn. There was a sound from the chimney stack she had not heard before, a low, steady pull, like wind moving through a hollow tree. That was the sound of proper draft. That was the sound of the fire breathing. She fed it for 3 hours. She fed it with the driest lodgepole she had split, thin to burn hot. The firebox stones radiated heat she could feel from 6 feet away. The channel stones warmed section by section as she moved her hand along the wall. First run, then the corner, then the second run, then the base of the exit stack. Each section, warmer than the last, had been an hour ago. By noon, the entire chimney mast was warm to the touch along its full length. By 3 in the afternoon, it was radiating heat that raised the cabin temperature to 48 degrees, while outside the snow had thickened and the thermometer of her body told her it was well below zero out there. Ida banked the coals, slid the flat stone across the firebox opening to trap the remaining heat in the mass, and sat down on her pine bough platform with her back against the channel wall. The stone was warm through her coat. She had not been warm, genuinely physically warm, not just less cold since the middle of October. She sat there for a long time without moving. That night she woke once around midnight and reached out to touch the chimney stones in the dark. Still warm, not hot. The fire had been out for 8 hours, but warm enough that she could hold her hand flat against the stone and feel heat moving into her palm. The cabin temperature had held around 40 degrees. Outside, she learned later from Dietrich, it had dropped to 6 below zero. She had slept through it. She woke again near dawn. The stones were cooler now, the heat fading toward ambient as the mass gave up the last of what the fire had put into it. But the cabin temperature was still 38 degrees. Outside, 6 below zero. A 32-degree differential maintained by nothing but stone, holding heat from a fire that had died 12 hours ago. Ernst Vogel had been right about all of it. Word moved through the valley the way word always moved in sparse country, person to person, slowly but with certainty. Within a week, people were stopping at the alcove to see the thing for themselves. Mabel Forsyth arrived on December 19th. She was 34 years old, a widow running her late husband's claim with 2 young children, and she had the practical eyes of a woman who had stopped having the luxury of dismissing things that might work. She tied her horse outside, walked in, and stood in the center of the cabin for a moment. Then she put both hands flat on the channel wall, held them there. The stones were warm from the morning fire, not hot, but the kind of steady, penetrating warmth that a wall should not have in December in Montana. She said, "I'll be damned. Ernst wasn't crazy. We just weren't listening." Before she left, Mabel said she would be rebuilding her place come spring, using this design, and asked if Ida would help. "Yes," Ada said. "I'll help anyone who wants to learn it." January 2nd arrived without announcement the way catastrophe usually does. Ida had fired the chimney hard that morning, 4 hours feeding it, steadily pushing the mass temperature it as high as she could get it. Something in the air had felt wrong since the night before. A stillness that was not calm but waiting. A pressure in her ears she associated with nothing good. The storm came from the northwest at midday. It arrived not as a gradual increase, but as a wall one that went from nothing to violent in the space of a breath, carrying snow horizontally, driving it into every crack and gap. The cabin walls flexed slightly and then held. The temperature outside dropped from 12 degrees to 0 to 10 below within the first 2 hours. The snow packed against the door, opening in thick slabs, the wind pressing it in faster than she could push it out. By mid-afternoon, the door was sealed, packed solid. She was inside, and she was staying inside. The storm did not stop. It ran through the night and through the next day and into the night again. The wind made a sound like something alive, not howling, which is what people who have not heard real blizzard wind call it, but a continuous structural roar that went through the cabin walls and through the stone and through the inside of her chest. The temperature outside dropped to 22 below, then 26, then 31 below zero. Inside the cabin, 42 degrees. Ida fired the chimney once every 20 hours, burning it hot for 3 hours, and then banking the coals and closing the damper, watching the cabin temperature rise to 52 degrees and then fall slowly back toward 38 over the following hours before she fired it again. She had enough wood inside to maintain this cycle for 2 weeks. She had water from melting snow in a pot near the chimney base. She had food for 5 days if she rationed it carefully. She was sealed inside a stone and earth cabin in the middle of a blizzard at 31 below zero, and she was not dying. On the second day of the storm, she sat with her back against the warm channel wall and thought about Garrison Pruitt, who had listed 4 reasons she would fail. She thought about each of his objections and where they stood now. The chimney had not collapsed. The foundation held. The firebox stones were cracking slightly at the edges. She could hear it, a faint tick in the heat cycles, but they were holding the essential structure. The draft worked. The French drain along the back wall had already handled the snowmelt that seeped down from above during the warmer days of December. 3 out of 4 holding, the fourth untested by spring but prepared for. She had no anger toward Garrison Pruitt. He had looked at her work and seen the real risks, which was more than most people had done. He had been wrong about the outcome, but he had been asking the right questions. On the third day of the storm, the wind stopped. The silence was physical, a sudden complete absence of sound that felt like pressure releasing. Ida stood and listened to it for a moment. Then she found her flat board shovel and began digging through the door. The valley outside was transformed in a way that had nothing to do with beauty, or rather had beauty only in the way that absolute indifference sometimes does. Drifts 10 feet high had built up along the western tree line. The creek was frozen solid from bank to bank. Every pine in sight was bent under snow. The branches curved down toward the ground like hands reaching. The light coming off the white surface was sharp enough to make her eyes water. Her cabin stood. The earthen roof had accumulated 3 feet of snow, which had actually helped the additional mass increasing the insulation above the interior. The front wall was intact. The chimney stack rose clean above the roof line, the wind cap exactly where she and Thaddeus had placed it undamaged. She stood outside in the first sunlight she had seen in 3 days and breathed air that burned her lungs at whatever temperature it had settled to after the storm's worst had passed. Dietrich Brauer arrived the next morning on his mule, moving carefully through drifts that in places reached the animal's chest. He came around the south side of the alcove and found Ida splitting wood outside. Her face was chapped red from the cold. Her hands were cracked at the knuckles. But her eyes were clear and her movements were the movements of someone who was not conserving strength because she was running out of it. Dietrich stopped the mule and looked at her for a moment. "You made it," he said. The words carried a weight that had nothing to do with their simplicity. This was a man who had seen 3 winters in this valley. He knew what the nights of January 2nd through 4th had been. "The Hargrove family," he said. 2 miles south. I found them yesterday." Ida stopped splitting. She looked at him. "Conventional fireplace," he said. 2 weeks of wood, gone in 3 days trying to stay warm. They ran out on the second night of the storm. She let that settle. The Hargroves had been doing what everyone did, building what everyone built the way everyone built it. A conventional fireplace that sent 80% of its heat up on the chimney. 2 weeks of wood that should have lasted 2 weeks but ran out in 3 days because when the temperature goes to 30 below, a conventional fireplace cannot keep up. It consumes wood as fast as you can feed it, and still the cold comes through. She looked at her own wood stack, more than half remaining. "I'll be spreading word about your design," Dietrich said. "Folks need to know there's a better way." He did not frame it as a compliment. He framed it as a fact and a responsibility, which was the only framing Ida would have accepted anyway. He turned the mule and rode back north through the drifts without further ceremony. February arrived the way a second creditor arrives after the first has already taken everything quietly without announcement, as if it had been waiting for exactly the moment when you believed the worst was behind you. The storm of January had been violent and acute, the kind of danger that sharpens the mind and drives the body past what it thinks it can do. February was different. February was slow and grinding and without drama. The temperature moderated to 0 and held there, which sounded like improvement, until you understood that 0 degrees sustained over weeks does something different to the human body than 30 below for 3 days. It does not attack. It simply persists. It waits. The game had gone somewhere. The snares along the creek came up empty day after day. The rose hips she had stripped from every bush within half a mile were long gone. The dried elk strips from the wolf kill in November had run out before Christmas. What she had left was cornmeal, a small quantity of beans Dietrich had brought, and the absolute bottom of a salt pork supply that had never been generous to begin with. She stretched it the way her mother had taught her to stretch things during the hard winters in Pennsylvania. Small portions taken slowly chewed thoroughly the stomach, trained to believe it had received more than it had. She boiled pine bark and drank the liquid. She chewed on a strip of leather she cut from the top of her left boot because the act of chewing seemed to matter even when there was nothing to swallow. She lost weight she could not afford to lose. Her hands, which had been strong, became uncertain. Simple tasks required rest afterward. She could feel her body making decisions about what to maintain and what to let go. On February 12th, the food ran out completely, not nearly out, not almost gone, gone. By February 15th, she was too weak to gather wood. She had a small reserve stacked inside enough for perhaps 2 fires, but carrying logs from outside was beyond what her body would currently do. She had not fired the chimney that morning because the effort of loading the firebox had used more energy than the heat would return to her. The cabin temperature dropped through the day, falling below freezing by late afternoon, settling toward 26 degrees by evening. She wrapped herself in the blanket and leaned against the chimney stones, which still held a residual warmth from the previous day's fire. And she thought about the problem the way her mother had taught her to think about problems, not as a whole terrifying thing, but as a series of smaller questions with answers. She had survived the coldest nights of the Montana winter. She had survived a blizzard that had killed the Hargrove family 2 miles south. She had built something that worked, something that mattered, something that people were already talking about across the valley. She sat against the cooling stones and stayed still. Garrison Pruitt came at midday on February 17th. She heard the horse before she saw him, hoofbeats on the frozen ground slowing as they approached the alcove. She did not get up from the platform. She was conserving. He came through the door opening, ducking under the frame, and stood in the dimness of the cabin while his eyes adjusted. He looked at her, at the stack of wood that was nearly gone, at the unlit firebox, at the blanket she had pulled around her shoulders, at whatever her face was showing that she could not entirely control. He did not say anything for a moment. Then he turned back to his horse and came back with a hindquarter of elk recently butchered, still heavy and dense with cold. He hung it from the roof pole. He went back out and came back with a cloth sack that he set on the sleeping platform beside her. Beans, a pound of cornmeal, a small paper packet of salt. He stood in the center of the cabin and looked at the cachalofen, at the firebox and channel walls and chimney mast she had built without proper tools in 3 weeks, on nothing but observation and determination. He looked at it the way an engineer looks at a solution he did not arrive at himself but cannot find fault with. "You were right about the chimney," he said. "I'm adapting the design for my place." He looked at her directly. "Consider this payment for the engineering lesson." Then he turned and went back through the door opening, and she heard his horse moving away, the hoofbeats fading until there was nothing but wind in the pines. Ida sat with the sack of beans in her lap and the smell of fresh meat coming down from the roof pole. Garrison Pruitt had come to list her failures in December. He had been wrong about the outcome. He was a man who had spent 20 years being the most technically competent person in any room, and he had watched a 16-year-old girl with no tools and no formal training build something he could not fault. He had not apologized. He had not explained himself. He had shown up with food and called it payment for an engineering lesson. For a man of his particular formation, former military technical, by training, pride built into the structure of his identity, that was not a small thing. That was in its own way everything. She built a fire that night and cooked meat and ate slowly, more slowly than she wanted to. She felt strength returning to her hands with the first meal. By the second day, she was carrying wood again. By the third, she was firing the chimney on schedule, and the cabin temperature was back to its reliable range. The worst was over. March 4th arrived with temperatures above freezing for the first time in months. Not warm. Nobody was calling it warm, but above freezing, which in Montana in March meant the world was making a decision. Ida walked out of the cabin into sunlight that had actual heat in it, thin and tentative but present, and stood in it for a while without moving. The snow was beginning to pull away from the south-facing slopes in dark patches. The creek, which had been solid ice since December and was making sounds again, a low movement under the ice surface water finding its way back. She checked the French drain she had dug along the back wall of the alcove. The snowmelt coming off the hillside above was moving into the channel and following it around the cabin's east side exactly as she had calculated. The interior floor was dry, the back wall was dry. Garrison Pruitt's fourth objection had been answered by a shovel in geometry. She found the first green shoots in a sheltered spot along the creek on March 7th, coming up through the dead leaf mat on the south bank. Not much, not edible yet, but present. She began to think about what came next. Mabel Forsyth came back on March 15th with her son, 12-year-old Daniel, who had the bright-eyed attention of a boy who had grown up watching his mother solve problems and had concluded that problems were interesting rather than frightening. He walked around the cabin asking questions Ida had not been asked before. Not the skeptical questions of Garrison Pruitt or the practical questions of Dietrich Brauer, but the questions of someone who wanted to understand the principle, not just the application. Why did the channels curve instead of going straight up? Because a straight path gives the smoke a straight exit and it takes the heat with it. The curves force the smoke to slow down and change direction. Every time it changes direction, it loses velocity and gives up heat to the stone around it. Why was the firebox at the bottom and not higher up? Because heat rises. If you put the heat source at the bottom, the warmth moves through the whole room on its way up. This heats the floor first. Why did the stone keep warm after the fire went out? Because stone has mass and mass resists change. It takes time for heat to move into stone, and it takes time for heat to move out. That resistance is what you're building when you build the mass. You're buying time. 18 hours of time between one fire and the next. Daniel absorbed all of it. He stood with his hand flat on the channel wall, feeling the warmth working out the implications. Mabel reached into her coat and brought out a cloth bundle. 4 potatoes, a chunk of salt pork, half a loaf of bread that was only slightly stale. Payment in advance, she said. Ida took it without protest because she understood what Mabel was doing. Not charity, but acknowledgement. You have done something worth learning from. Tell me everything, Mabel said, from the foundation up. Spring opened the valley the way a hand opens slowly, then all at once. By late March, Ida was gathering materials for the expansion she had been planning since January. A second room added to the east side of the alcove. A proper door with hinges she carved from hardwood. Window openings covered with scraped hide stretched tight across frames translucent enough to let light in without letting wind through. She kept the original cachalofen as the heart of the heating system. The new room would share its warmth through an opening in the channel wall, a calculated gap that let radiant heat move between spaces without requiring a second fire. She helped Mabel Forsyth rebuild in April. They worked the foundation together, Ida directing and demonstrating, Mabel and Daniel executing. The new cachalofen was larger than Ida's original. This was a bigger cabin with more space to heat and required more careful calculation of channel length to firebox volume ratio. Ida worked it out over 2 evenings, and when they built it, the draft was right on the first fire. Mabel's wood consumption that first winter dropped 60% compared to her previous cabin. In September 1874, the railroad crew arrived. Thaddeus Wren had told the foreman about the girl in the valley who had survived the previous winter alone, built her own shelter, and could cook. Ida agreed to cook for 30 men through November in exchange for wages she intended to spend on tools, seed, and materials she could not make herself. She cooked. She was good at it, efficient, consistent, unimpressed by the scale. But the work she valued most happened in the evenings after supper, when the men sat around their fires with nothing required of them. She would crouch down and draw in the dirt with a stick. Firebox here, channel runs here and here, corner here, second run back toward the front, exit stack with wind cap at the top, stone and clay mortar serpentine path, 15 feet of heat exchange before the smoke exits. The men asked questions the way men who build things for a living ask questions, specific, practical oriented toward execution rather than theory. How deep does the foundation need to be? What kind of stone works and what kind fails? How do you know when the mortar mix is right? She answered everything. Two of them built their own versions at their claims that winter. Both reported back through Thaddeus the following spring the design worked. Wood consumption down by more than half. Interior temperatures maintained through nights when conventional fireplaces had failed their neighbors. By the spring of 1875, there were 7 masonry heaters operating in the valley. People were coming from other settlements to see them. Clarence Aldrich arrived in the summer of 1876. He was a surveyor working for the territorial government documenting frontier architecture. What worked in Montana's climate, what failed, why the failure rate in first-year homesteads was so high, and what the survivors had done differently. He had heard about a cabin in the Bozeman Trail Valley built by a 16-year-old girl in 1873 that was still standing and still heating efficiently 3 years later. He spent 3 days at the alcove. He measured everything. The firebox dimensions, the channel cross-sections, at multiple points, the total length of the serpentine path, the mass volume of the chimney structure relative to the cabin's interior volume. He calculated the theoretical heat retention based on the stone's thermal mass properties, and then tested it empirically, firing the chimney to operating temperature, banking the coals, and measuring the cabin temperature at 2-hour intervals for 20 hours. 74% heat retention. He wrote it down, checked his arithmetic, wrote it again. A conventional fireplace retained approximately 18% of combustion heat in the room. Ida's Kakelofen retained 74%. The difference was not incremental. It was the difference between a system that worked and a system that only appeared to work until the temperature dropped far enough to show the truth. He interviewed Ida for 2 days, asking her to reconstruct every design decision, why she had chosen the specific channel geometry, how she had calculated the draft requirements, what she had changed after the first failed fire, and why. She answered from memory, which was precise and detailed, in the way that memory is precise when the decisions being remembered were made under conditions where being wrong meant dying. His report, submitted to the territorial government in Helena in the spring of 1877, called the cabin a remarkable example of intuitive engineering, combining European thermal mass principles with the demands of frontier construction and the specific thermal challenges of the Montana climate. He noted the fuel efficiency, the temperature, maintenance data, the structural integrity of a building now in its 4th year with no foundation settlement and no significant mortar failure. He noted that the designer had been 16 years old and had no formal training of any kind. Ida read the report when Clarence brought her a copy. She read it twice carefully. She did not find any errors. She set it down and looked at Clarence Aldrich, who had spent 3 days measuring what she had built, and 2 days asking how she had built it, and who had written 20 pages about a 16-year-old girl's work, without once suggesting it was surprising that a 16-year-old girl had done it. She decided she liked him. They were married in 1878. Not because she needed rescuing, she had demonstrated comprehensively that she did not, but because he was the first person who had come to the alcove to learn from her, rather than to help her judge her or prove her wrong. That distinction mattered to Ida Calloway in a way she could not have explained simply, but understood completely. By 1880, 43 families in the valley were using masonry heater designs derived from Ida's original cabin. The winter death rate from cold-related causes in that valley dropped from 12%, the rate recorded in the 3 years before Ida built her Kakelofen, to less than 2% over the 6 years following. Ernst Vogel's principles, ignored on the wagon train, taught to a 16-year-old girl who was paying attention, had changed the mathematics of survival in Montana territory. The old stonemason had drawn his diagrams in the dirt and watched people walk past. He had not lived to see what happened when one person stopped and listened. Ida thought about him sometimes in the evenings, sitting in the cabin that had grown from 1 room to 6 while the original Kakelofen remained at its center. She thought about what it meant to know something important and be unable to make people hear it. She thought about the difference between having knowledge and having knowledge at the right moment and about how sometimes the right moment required being thrown from a wagon onto a Montana road in November with nothing but a blanket and a head full of carefully observed facts. She taught everyone who came to learn. She charged a fair fee and did not apologize for it because the knowledge had cost her things that could not be calculated in dollars. And she had no patience for the idea that expertise should be given away to demonstrate it was not presumptuous to have it. She taught Mabel Forsyth's son Daniel, who grew up to build masonry heaters professionally across 3 territories. She taught the railroad men who came through each fall and took the design back to their winter claims. She taught the new settlers who arrived each spring with Eastern confidence and no concept of what the first Montana winter would actually require of them. She taught them all the same thing Ernst Vogel had tried to teach on the wagon train. Thermal mass is not a trick or a novelty. It is physics. It is the difference between a heating system that fights the cold and a heating system that outlasts it. In 1924, Ida Calloway Aldrich was 67 years old, and a reporter from the Billings Gazette came to the house to ask her about the early years. He was young and earnest, and he asked her how it felt to have survived what most people would consider impossible odds. She looked at him for a moment. "I didn't think about odds," she said. "I thought about problems and solutions. Needed shelter, found a hillside. Needed heat, remembered Ernst's stove. Needed to survive, so I did the work." He wrote it down. He printed it in the paper the following Thursday, framed by paragraphs about frontier hardship and feminine resilience and the remarkable spirit of the early settlers. He missed the point, which was that there was nothing remarkable about what Ida had done, in the sense that remarkable implies something beyond normal human capacity. What she had done was observe carefully, think clearly, execute precisely, and refuse to stop when the situation became difficult. These were not superhuman qualities. They were just qualities that required practice, and she had practiced them in conditions that did not permit error. The frontier had not cared about her feelings, or her age, or her gender. It had cared only whether she could learn fast enough and work hard enough. It turned out she could. She lived until 1937. She died at 80 years old in the same valley where she had almost frozen at 16. In her last years, she spent her mornings in the chair by the east window of the original room, the one she had built first with the cachalofen at her back. Not because she needed the heat, the house had grown and changed around her over 6 decades, but because she liked to feel the stones. She had a habit in those final years of pressing her palm flat against the channel wall in the mornings after the fire had been burning. An hour feeling the warmth move through the stone into her hand, still finding in it what she had found the very first time, the confirmation that the physics were sound, that the calculation had been right, that the thing she had built in December 1873 with frozen hands and borrowed tools and a head full of an old man's careful words was still doing exactly what it was supposed to do. Clarence had died in 1921. Their children were grown and scattered across Montana and beyond. The valley she had almost died in was a community now. Roads where there had been trails, schools where there had been nothing, families who had come to stay because the early settlers had figured out how to survive here and had taught each other and had built something that held. In 1952, the National Forest Service acquired the property. A structural engineer named Howard Bassett was sent to assess the original cabin before the decision was made to dismantle it. For safety reasons, the roof had begun to fail, the log frames of the front wall had deteriorated, and the hillside above was showing erosion that would eventually compromise the alcove structure. Howard Bassett was methodical and unsentimental. He went through the cabin systematically noting deterioration, measuring settlement, checking joint integrity. He came to the cachalofen last. It was 1952. The chimney had been built in December 1873 by a 16-year-old girl using creek stone and creek clay and no tools that a professional mason would have recognized as adequate. 79 years had passed. 79 Montana winters, each one capable of temperatures below -30, each one putting the masonry through the expansion and contraction cycles that Garrison Pruitt had said the clay mortar could not survive. Howard Bassett checked every joint he could access. He tapped stones with his knuckle and listened to what they said. He ran his thumb along mortar lines and pressed where he could see potential separation. He wrote in his report, the firebox structure shows minor surface spalling consistent with age, but is fundamentally intact. The channel walls are sound throughout their accessible length. The mortar joints, while visibly aged, have not failed at any point examined. The chimney exit stack is structurally sound. He wrote in the professional opinion of this examiner, the masonry heater structure is still functional. It could, if the surrounding structure were repaired and fuel supplied, be operated today. 79 years, built by a 16-year-old girl with frozen hands and a borrowed axe in the remembered words of an old German stonemason whom almost everyone had ignored. The stone held. Several pieces were carefully removed before the rest of the structure was dismantled. The cornerstones of the firebox, a section of channel wall, the capstone of the wind cap that Ida and Thaddeus Wren had placed together in December 1873. These were transported to Helena and placed in the collection of the Montana Historical Society Museum. The label read, "Early Example of Cachalofin-Style Masonry Heater." Built December 1873. Ida Calloway Aldrich, age 16. Bozeman Trail, Valley, Montana Territory. Operational for 79 years. Harlan Calloway had thrown his daughter from a wagon on the Bozeman Trail on November 14, 1873, into dust and cold, in a landscape that killed most of the people who found themselves unprepared in it. He had done it because she taught her sisters to read. Because he believed that knowledge in the wrong hands, small hands, female hands, young hands, was dangerous. He was wrong about all of it. What she carried in her head was the design of a heating system that would keep 43 families warm through Montana winters, that would drop the valley's cold weather death rate from 12% to under 2%, that would outlast every conventional fireplace built in that valley in the same decade, that would stand for 79 years and be carried to a museum when it finally came down. He could not have imagined any of that. Ida could. Not on that November road, sitting in the dust, watching the wagon go. She was not imagining legacy. Then she was solving the immediate problem of staying alive through the night. But she knew what she knew. She knew that Ernst Vogel's diagrams were sound. She knew that the hillside alcove was the right site. She knew that the calculation she had been running in her head for weeks would work if she executed it correctly. She knew that the stone would hold. It held for 79 years. Some things built with frozen hands and stubborn intelligence, and the willingness to learn from a man that everyone else walked past. Some things built like that do not merely survive. They last.